So good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're pleased to welcome Tony Hiss this evening in support of rescuing the planet, protecting half the land to heal the earth. The chat is closed, as I mentioned, but you might want to keep the chat window open during the event, as I will be dropping links to purchase Rescuing the Planet from Literati. We do have signed book plates, so if you want a signed book plate from Tony, just let us know as you're checking out in the memo field, and we'll make sure you get one. We can make them available to you curbside pickup if you live in Ann Arbor, or ship it to anywhere in the United States. And of course, if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books in the description directly below me. And if you're watching us live, of course, you can submit questions for the Q&A portion using the Q&A feature available to you at the bottom of your screen at any time. And I will read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of the presentation. As a reminder, you can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan, or to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And in lieu of a book purchase, we also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our programming, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. And now I'll introduce tonight's author. Tony Hiss is the author of 15 books, including the award-winning The Experience of Place. He was a staff writer at The New Yorker for more than 30 years, was a visiting scholar at New York University for 25 years, and has lectured around the world. He lives in New York with his wife, young adult writer Lois Metzger. We can't hear you, but we can certainly sense you through the power of the internet. So please join me in welcoming Tony Hiss into your living rooms. Tony, thank you so much for joining us tonight on At Home with Literati. And I'd like to invite you to go ahead and get started with your presentation, and then I'll jump back in afterwards to ask you some questions.
Well, first, just let me say, John, what a pleasure it is to be here at this wonderful, beloved indie bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor. I gather spring is finally springing, and you even had a double rainbow over downtown Ann Arbor last night. So that's an auspicious moment in which to talk about the subject of this book, which is how we can stave off a mass extinctions crisis that threatens the existence of 1 million species of animals and plants. I'd like to show you just a few pictures. This is about what's sometimes called the other environmental crisis. In addition to climate change, so many species which seemed permanent residents of the Earth are threatened. 1 million, I said, we might lose. This is the last day of Sudan, the last male northern white rhino who died in Kenya just a few years ago, with his beloved keeper by his side, who'd come in for one last rub behind the ear. It's a crisis that's given us a word we never wanted or hoped to need, an endling. An endling is the last of its species. This, for instance, is Lonesome George, the last Pinta Island tortoise in the Galapagos, who died just a few years ago at the age of 101. One of the reasons we've had trouble is that for a long time it was hard to think about more than one thing at once. This is a once famous painting from the 1870s called American Progress. Progress being that golden-haired young lady not wearing very many clothes, who is trailing telegraph wires behind her and accompanied as she marches or floats from east to west, accompanied by a stagecoach, covered wagon, and train lines. Now, I'm a big train fan myself. Got nothing against trains, but we seem to think we could only do one thing at a time. In that case, progress the inexorable progress was displacing the Native American population, the bison, and at the lower left, you can see a snarling bear retreating into the darkness. It's always much lighter in the east too. That was before we realized that part of progress was darkening the skies. Fortunately, some people have for a long time been able to look beyond loss to a larger picture. One of the first was a young, craggy New England forester named Benton Mackay, who, when he graduated from college in 1900, decided to celebrate by bushwhacking his way up Stratton Mountain in Vermont, climbed to the top of the tallest tree he could find, swayed there, and suddenly, as he said, a vision came into his mind of that entire range of mountains, the Appalachians, stretching from Maine to Georgia, crossing 14 states. He later called it a planetary feeling. And because of his inspiration, the Appalachian Trail, 2,190 miles long, came into being after he announced his plan formally 100 years ago this year in 1921. It took only a dozen years to be completed, and it was entirely done by volunteers. One of the things I like about my book particularly is that I was able to commission this beautiful end papers map, which shows the 4 largest landscapes in North America. The one on the right, stretching from top to bottom, is the Appalachians, actually the smallest of the 4. Mackay's vision extended beyond the mountaintops to what he called the realm, meaning the larger landscape beyond. And that's a vision that's only just now coming into being. Then it's paralleled to the west by the Rockies. And a more recent visionary, a Canadian lawyer and activist named Harvey Locke, had a similar experience one night when he was camping in the Rockies, and he said to himself, I'm in the presence of a single landscape that extends from Yellowstone National Park, the very first national park, a great North American invention, all the way up to the top of the Yukon. He called it Yellowstone to Yukon, Y to Y, started a group that promoted protecting Y to Y. They've now protected at least 21% of that landscape. And they're now thinking of themselves as part of an even larger landscape, a mountain chain running from Mexico all the way up to Alaska. The most recently discovered of these large landscapes is along the south coast of the US, the North American Coastal Plain Biodiversity Hotspot. Well, it's a good thing people started thinking bigger, because the conventional way of protecting animals, the idea of locking them up in national parks, wasn't working very well, even as long ago as 1988, when the New York Times ran a big piece saying species are disappearing from parks. Turns out animals had a different idea of their boundaries than we did. And also, as national parks began to be isolated from each other by development, there was no way for the animals to get from one way to another. So all of this has been leading to what's now called half Earth, the idea that if we could protect half the land, we could save most of the species. The question I get asked most often is, why half Earth? Why that particular percentage? Well, it's, for one thing, it's sort of a splitting the difference compromise between scientific studies showing that some species have to retain at least 25% of their original habitat in order to thrive. Others, more sensitive, have to retain at least 75% of their original landscape to survive. In the 150 years after Yellowstone was set off, we've only put aside about 15% of North America to protect species. And unfortunately, we can also now do some biological mathematics. And that seems to indicate that if we stayed at 15%, we might wind up with 25% or less of the existing species, of the millions and millions existing. And that's why 1 million species are already at risk. But if we bump that up to 50%, there's a good chance that 85 to 90% of all plants and animals can survive. Not everyone, but almost everyone. So that's the down and dirty math on the half Earth blackboard. I'd like you to look for a moment into the eyes the rather fierce-looking eyes of this Russian biologist, Vladimir Jovanovich Vernatsky. Died in 1945, still relatively unknown in our part of the world. Beloved and revered in Russia, where he's considered the equivalent of Charles Darwin. A Moscow metro station is named after him. A crater on the dark side of the moon is named after him. In the 1920s, Vernatsky wrote the first definitive book about the biosphere. Biosfera was the name of the book. And he unveiled for us its three most profound and fundamental characteristics. On the one hand, it is ancient, 3.8 billion years old or older. Another characteristic is its seeming permanence and persistence. And it's huge when seen from side to side. But he pointed out it has a third characteristic, its height, or rather its lack of height. All of life is contained in this band around the surface of the earth, and almost all life exists within a single band between the bottom of the ocean and the top of Mount Everest. Well, that's only 12.5 miles. Laid out horizontally, it's a distance you could drive in less than 20 minutes, which means that if it were a horizontal distance, you could drive from one end of life to the other in 20 minutes. I think that's beginning to make its way into our minds. Astronauts who've gotten to actually get beyond the atmosphere and look back are often struck by the beauty and wonder of the place, but also by its vulnerability, the fact that it's so gossamer thin. This is sometimes called the overview effect. One of the challenges now is to feel that overview effect while still down here. I sometimes think of it as an inner view effect. Of course, we'll keep making more and more wonderful discoveries about the biosphere. The things that have to be squeezed in. For instance, this charming little spider that was discovered a few years ago in India and given the scientific name Aerovixia gryffindori. That's because the scientists thought it looked more than anything like the sorting hat in Harry Potter, and they thought more people would learn to love spiders if they associated it with Harry Potter. On the right is a griffin in Africa that can fly so high, one of them once collided with a jet plane. So back to our half-Earth math. Within this enormous but vulnerable, built-in vulnerably context of the biosphere, there are what I like to think of as 3 R's, the 3 essential steps that can keep life alive. One is retain all that's still wild, like the amazing Boreal Forest landscape. Another is restore what was once wilder. And the third is reconnect places that got severed. How many of the people tuning in here tonight can recognize this particular place? It has oak trees that are more than 300 years old. It's a wetland of international importance. It's a home to 154 species of birds, including bald eagles. And a huge number of other birds funnel through in spring and fall. It's a place of 51 species of fish, including lake sturgeon and walleye. Beaver, which had disappeared, have reappeared. And when you get there, you immediately recognize yourself as being in a very special place. The feel of it, the air of it, the quietness of it. Need a hint? It's not very far away. Give up? It's Humbug Marsh on the Detroit River. Not far from downtown Detroit, not that far from downtown Ann Arbor. Now the centerpiece and headquarters for the Detroit River National Wildlife Refuge. There are 567 national wildlife refuges in the US. This is the only international wildlife refuge, thanks to a new kind of continental cooperation between us and the Canadians on the other side of the river. It's part of the great decades-long rescue of the Detroit River. It was only 52 years ago that the Rouge River caught on fire for 7 hours with flames shooting 50 feet in the sky. But why is Humbug Marsh still here? It was the last undeveloped mile along the American side, the US American side of the Detroit River. But then the Friends of the Detroit River stepped in. Thousands of them got together starting in 1995. Very much an ad hoc affair. They ran bingo games for 3 months. They had 3 spaghetti dinners to raise money. They wrote flyers. They went door to door, all done by volunteers. And what that last undeveloped mile is now the centerpiece and headquarters of the wonderful Detroit River National Wildlife Refuge. And now that it is, trees that were here before Cadillac founded Detroit in 1701 are part of everyone's heritage. Among birders, there's a wonderful phrase, spark bird, meaning that bird that first caught their attention some time ago and hooked them for life, giving them forever a sense of being reattached to nature. But, it doesn't have to be a bird. It could be a wildflower. It could be a view. It could be the thoughts that come into your mind as you swing from a tree on top of a mountain. It could be the fact that you weren't going to let the last undeveloped mile along the Detroit River get developed. Thank you very much for listening to this. And as we already heard, we can't do a regular book signing these days for the duration, but we can offer you signed book plates. And as a special inducement, if you're interested, and if you tell James, I would be happy to inscribe a book plate to you personally. If he'll send me your name and I'll send the book plate back to Literati.
Thank you, Tony. Yes, I'd be happy to facilitate a signed book plate, personalized book plate if you want one. Please just let us know in the comments as you check out on literatibookstore.com. We'll be sure to do that. And of course, you're watching us later on YouTube. Link to purchase is in the description right below me, and it applies to you wherever and whenever you're watching. Tony, thank you for that excellent presentation and really hitting us at home there at the end with how the things that this book is talking about and the 50 by 50 idea in general is indeed touches us even right in our own backyards, and it's very cool to have mention of the stuff that the Friends of the Detroit River have done in conservation efforts. And I also like that it includes, and I guess this gets me to my first question for you, this international cooperation between the US and Canadians and in Canada on the other side. And it gets to the last R that you mentioned of reconnecting. And one of the things that I'm curious about, and I hope you don't mind a bit of a naive question, but so many of the stories in the book, it's truly, literally globe spanning. There are these efforts to have conservation on the continent of Australia. The book opens with the Boreal mountain ranges. You mentioned some of sort of these natural zones as well. But I wonder if you could talk more about reconnection and, how much of these efforts needs to be contiguous, connecting ecosystem to ecosystem as it continues to develop in a sort of patchwork fashion from government initiatives to, as you talk about with the Friends of the Detroit River, community efforts to et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I'm glad you asked. There are places like the Boreal Forest, which is perhaps the last most intact, biggest wild landscape left anywhere on the planet. It's hard for a city boy like myself, even now that I've been there, to capture it in my mind, because it's 3,700 miles long. That's so much longer than just the distance between New York and San Francisco. It's 1,000 miles from top to bottom. And it's less cut over than the Amazon, less cut over than the Siberian taiga, 85% intact. And in terms of reconnecting there, what the Canadians are finally doing is turning to the people who've been there for 10,000 years, the First Nations, the Native American populations up there, and inviting them to become the stewards officially of vast tracts of land, which are now being called Indigenous Protected Areas, IPAs. And the Indigenous people are in fact saving the Canadian government's bacon, because Canada had pledged to protect something like 17% of the country by 2020 and was way behind. It was only at about 11 or 12%. But now, thanks to the work of Indigenous rangers who can become rangers from within in these parks, people who've known about this land and how it operates for 10,000 years, they can be what's called the mucklucks on the ground. So that's one way of reconnecting. That's reconnecting within a pretty much intact landscape. In other places that are more, have larger populations and not just indigenous people, we're in luck in this continent because less than 40% of the place is occupied. So it's not like we're talking about displacing people. And it's just, there are a lot of overlooked landscapes that are wilder and that can serve as the conduits between larger pieces of wild landscape. This is one of the people I write about is a wonderful biologist named Reed Noss, who sort of had this vision about how it was one thing to talk about having a core area and then having a semi-protected area around it, a buffer zone. But the buffer zone, you could take a scissors to it, you could slice it, you could spread it out, it could stretch from one big area all the way up to another area. And he did a map of Florida showing how this would be possible. And he said he didn't expect to get much attention, but for some reason a candidate for governor happened by the press conference where they announced this, and suddenly it was news. And now Florida has been able to protect something like 30% of that land. And Reed was on the rebound at that point because he came from Southern Ohio, and along the Ohio River Valley, he'd seen there were similar possibilities and proposed that. And his superiors in the State Department he worked for were horrified that he was getting beyond himself and above himself. This was way too ambitious. So he retreated to Florida, where it became a success. That's interesting because now we're talking, suddenly it's become news. The Biden administration is talking about 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the US by 2030. 56 countries have embraced this as an idea. There's going to be, we don't know if it's going to be virtual or face-to-face, but a huge meeting of 196 countries in China in October, where it's expected that practically in the entire world will embrace this 30 by 30 goal. It's interesting because when I started working on this book, really 10 years ago, one of the first pieces of luck I had was meeting Edward O. Wilson, the great Harvard conservationist and biologist who was nice enough to write a foreword to the book. And he said, well, we've got to think bigger. I was talking with him, I actually came up with the phrase half Earth. But he said, sometimes you just throw that out to wake people up. It was what he called a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. And sometimes you just have to say it to get people's attention. And he said, sometimes it works, as when John Kennedy challenged us to put a man on the moon in a decade. And sometimes at least it gets things started in succession. Well, suddenly that goal, which was ridiculed by people at first, has become almost commonplace. So that's another part of the good news. And I should say that the book itself is full of good news because I think so many people are already working on this all over the continent. It was my privilege to travel around Canada and the US and bits of Mexico, and doing so many different things, embracing so many different strategies that I think we have a real chance as humanity to make sure that this planet and biosphere retains not only us, but all those other wonderful plants and animals as well.
Yes. And that's interesting to think of too, reconnection as sort of reconnecting various, independent nation state entities on the idea of conservation efforts like the 30 by 30. And it would make sense to have some sort of global solidarity about those conservation efforts. We hear a lot about things like the Paris Climate Accords, reducing emissions and stuff like that. We don't hear a lot about land conservation and those efforts as well. And that's one of the things that struck me about your book is that, truthfully, the whole notion of 50 by 50 was, to me, I wouldn't claim to be an environmental activist, to my own detriment, perhaps, but I follow the news about this stuff, and it was not something I had heard of before, right? You certainly hear about the effects to our biosphere, whether that's the wildfires in Australia a couple of years ago, or deforestation in the Amazon that's being ramped up because of Bolsonaro's administration. That's incredibly frightening and devastating. And you hear about how much oxygen that supplies to the world, but you don't hear about really the fact that one of the largest contiguous intact wild spaces in North America is going to be protected by indigenous people. Or you don't hear about these efforts that you just mentioned by the Biden administration or countries in league with one another to reach this sort of 30% goal.
Well, it's sort of just bursting on the scene, James.
Right.
As we speak, suddenly it is, I think, the next big thing. So much attention has been paid to climate change, and rightly so. But the same international meeting that set up that framework, set up this Convention on Biological Diversity, which has been overshadowed for a long time by the climate change activists. And as I said, of course, it's imperative we address that. But actually, the two issues are intertwined in ways that we are only beginning to become aware of. For instance, the Boreal Forest has two nicknames. It's called North America's Bird Nursery, because something like 3 billion birds fly up there every spring to raise the next generation. But it's also called the Fort Knox of carbon, because so much carbon is locked up in those trees, the black spruce trees there, and in the soil and in the peat under the soil, that if it were to be released simultaneously into the atmosphere, it would be catastrophic. It would be the equivalent of something like 37 years of fossil fuel emissions all at one swoop. So that's one of the reasons why suddenly we're paying more attention. The other is just, I think, people feeling the plight of the animals. And a third reason is that the animals themselves are beginning to tell us about their needs. Now that we can track them, put collars on them or put little chips on them or in them that can be traced by satellites, we're suddenly finding out that they have a very different definition of what the place is than we do. That Y2Y, the Yellowstone to Yukon movement, I mentioned Harvey Locke as its visionary, but really the co-founder was a wolf named Pluie, who was captured in Banff National Park during a fierce rainstorm. That was why she got the name Pluie, and given a collar. And they thought, well, maybe she'll wander around a bit. Wolves do wander around a bit, we know that. But then her collar went dead, and they thought, oh, well, this is science. A few months later, NASA engineers said, we just picked up a trace of your wolf, but we're down here in Idaho, not up there in Banff National Park. Well, it turned out over the next 18 months, Pluie traversed an area 10 times the size of Yellowstone National Park. through 3 US states and 2 Canadian provinces. So we had to really rethink an awful lot of things, back to the drawing boards. Thank goodness for the animals having a voice in this now.
That's wonderful. It also reminds me of a friend of the bookstores, Oliver Uberti, who's a designer, who recently put out a sort of visual book about tracking animals. To exactly this point, that one of the things they've learned through advanced tracking of animals is that their sort of territory or the sort of circuitous routes that they take are often much larger than we would have anticipated, the amount of ground they cover.
Yes, it's a fascinating subject, and it seems to be leading up to something even bigger, which a German scientist named Martin Wikelski is working on, which he calls the animal internet. They've now deployed material on the International Space Station that will be able to pick up signals from something like 300,000 animals around the world simultaneously, giving us an extraordinary different picture of the world and melding what they know with what we know. So much is happening. That's why it was really a pleasure as well as a privilege to write this book at this point, just when suddenly we're beginning to think 30 by 30, what does that mean? 50 by 50? Is that possible? Is it realistic? Is it achievable? Should it be achieved? Answer to all those questions is yes.
Well, there's a question from an audience member, perhaps a bit to this point. Do you have any insight, they ask, into what a sustainable human population would be at our current level of technological development with 50% of the land environment left untouched?
Well, we don't know. We're in uncharted waters. We know that probably the US population will increase by another 100 million or so before it starts to taper off. So clearly we have to find room for those people. So it's a challenge. But the fact that we at least have some slack, that less than 40% of the continent is covered with human activity at this point, means that we don't have to suddenly think about triage when it comes to us versus them. Was there another part of the question?
Yeah, just the question was just in general what a sustainable human population would be with that. But as you're mentioning, you're saying less than 40% of land is occupied by humans to begin with.
We don't really know, and
Yeah.
There are advances. In fact, I was just reading an article, too late to put in the book, that a Spanish chef has discovered that seagrass has seeds in it which have 50% more protein than rice. So we could start feeding people just from the ocean.
From the ocean, yeah.
So of course, all kinds of ingenuity is at work, and that's wonderful. But we've got to. The first part of it is to retain what is still wild, and fortunately, there's enough of it. And fortunately, not just in the Boreal, but in lands around the world, wildlands around the world, most of them have indigenous populations who are ready and willing to step up to become its protectors and guardians and stewards. So they've got to become an important part of the conversation in ways that we never invited them to be before.
Thank you for mentioning that. And there's so many wonderful stories about just that happening in the book, whether that's, as I mentioned at the outset, with the IPAs in the Boreal Forest, and as well the country, as it's referred to, is in Australia, where something like, I forget, I was just reading that section of the book, 160 million acres or something like that is protected and watched over by the Aboriginal people of Australia. Extraordinary.
There's this sort of Canadian-Australian axis.
Yes.
Here in the States, we never suspected, which is leaps and bounds ahead of us, but we're going to try and catch up.
Well, one thing I'll ask you before we maybe move to a couple last questions from our audience, is, you've mentioned a couple of times here in our conversation that the notion of 50 by 50 or 30 by 30 is introduced in some countries is new. It's sort of exploding onto the scene. And I wonder if, I mentioned as well, hearing a lot about climate change from the aspect of mass industrialization, deforestation, general human activities. And I'm curious if you'd be willing to touch on a little bit about where those two butt heads. Land conservation seems like a really wonderful and easy way, especially with a lot of extant contiguous wild spaces still in existence, of preserving biospheres, or preserving our biosphere by preserving those ecosystems. And my curiosity is, are countries or nonprofit organizations or whomever getting behind this because of its, not of its ease, but, where does conservation meet regulation? And so what is the interplay between simply this big idea of 50 by 50 and still, unfettered, thanks to just, economic necessity, mass industrialization, mining of precious metals. We have people now using natural gas reserves to power server farms to mine cryptocurrencies. Where does conservation meet and meld regulation?
Wow, well, that's a big question.
I know it's a thorny one to get into, but I just, if you
And
want to just like a couple, it's the tidbit.
no, I'll barge ahead. Because of course it isn't just 50 by 50 there, as you were just saying. There's what happens in our 50%. That has an impact on things too.
Right.
Bill Gates just wrote a book that addresses that subject, which is talking about how we need to rethink all the stuff we do that has had deleterious effects we didn't intend. We have to learn how to mine better. We have to learn how to make steel better without wasting so much energy. It's that picture I showed of American progress. Progress doesn't have to be all one thing. It can be thinking about two things at once. What's the impact going to be? Yes, we need the steel. Yes, we need the aluminum in the mines, but there are different ways of doing it. It's just that ever since the Bronze Age, we've thought, well, that's for the next guy to think about. Now the next guy is us. Almost every species tinkers with the planet to make things a little bit easier for them. Birds build nests, beavers build dams. Well, humans tinker on a scale that no one else has been able to come up with. But we've always assumed that the resources are infinite. And now that we're getting this more Vernatskian vision, that yes, the world is infinitely huge, but it's so thin. It's like the edge of an envelope, thin. All of what we do has to fit within that space. And that's prompting a different kind of rethinking, which isn't just setting stuff aside, but looking at what we do day by day to think, could we do it more effectively, more efficiently? And for that matter, cheaper.
Right. Do you think that if half Earth ideas take greater foothold and we see greater cooperation in conservation efforts at a large scale, like the scale of what's happening in the Boreal Forest, that there would be some sort of, I don't know, sense of necessary constraints on the part of industrial enterprises to sort of compensate for that?
Well, I think we are beginning to see that. And we're also beginning to see how we could go back and rethink some of the things we've already done. New England is this forested landscape. It was 90% forested when the Pilgrims arrived. Then in the early 19th century, there was something called the sheep craze. Everyone thought they could get rich by raising sheep. And they cut down 4/5 of the forest. And that's when the New England's famous stone walls were built. They were actually the edges of sheep pens going all through the landscape. Well, the sheep craze went bust after a while. The farmers moved to the Midwest to much richer soil, and the forests sprang back. And now they have a vision of protecting at least 70% of that whole 6-state region as a permanent forest. But it made me think in the 1950s and 60s, we built the interstate highway system. And it turned out to be, in addition to everything else it's done for us, a series of sheep pens for wild critters. Those rights of way are so wide, they're lethal for animals to try and cross. Something like 1 to 2 million large animals are killed on American highways every year. Well, again, up in Canada in Banff National Park, they've come up with a terrific solution to this. You build a series of bridges and tunnels that are just for animals. And since they've started doing that, something like 200,000 grizzly bears and mountain lions and mule deer and everything else have made these crossings safely. Turns out some animals like to go over, some like to go under, but they all like to get across. But here's another retrofit question, reconnect question.
Yeah.
Think of the millions of miles of highways in the US that are going to need that kind of rethinking.
Tony, I just want to say before we go to our last 2 questions from the audience that I appreciate your optimism very much, your ability to find these exciting ways that extant problems can have really advantageous solutions. Is
well, I hate to say it, but it's a very hopeful book.
As you mentioned, and that's I think one of its strengths deeply. Yeah, I think that's good.
So many people are at work on this, and in so many different ways, and finding common cause. And I think it's actually a terrible problem we have a good chance of overcoming. All kinds of people finding commonality where they never expected it. Even out in the wild, people who protect landscapes, that's their interest, are beginning to make common cause with people who like to walk through landscapes, the trails people. Always thought of themselves as 2 separate communities, but now see that they're in the same business together.
Our friend Allison Swan writes, I find the concept of Half Earth inspiring and energizing. Thank you. Will you talk a little bit about your spark bird? So what was your spark bird for perhaps this book?
Well, I have to say that it was somewhat cumulative. Different things happened at different moments. Outside of Boston, there's an oak tree that's been growing since before the Pilgrims arrived. It's the last of its stand. 100 years ago, it was part of a little grove of trees, and it was discovered by a brilliant young landscape architect named Charles Elliott, who had the idea of making a connected network of green all around the Boston area, beyond the city limits. And this was one of the first places he wanted to protect, was the Waverly Oaks, as they're called. Unfortunately, a trolley line had just been run out there, and people galloped out there to have picnics beneath the Waverly Oaks, and they loved the trees to death, and only one is still there. But being able to sit under its gnarled branches gave me a sense of this long span of time that's available. So a few things along the way buoyed me like that. And then just the idea that there is enough left for us to hope that this beleaguered planet has space enough and time enough for all of us, all us critters, humans and the rest.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and a viewer writes, thank you so much for your book. I've been waiting for just such a book that gives voice to the critters in their place. what other books do you recommend? This is one of my favorite questions as a bookseller, because who better to source book recommendations from than other authors? But what other books do you recommend? Books that also provide an optimistic and necessary vision.
Well, I think some of the environmental classics like Aldo Leopold, Sand County Almanac, is beautiful writing and has never really been surpassed. That reminds me of another story in the book. One of the landscapes that's being rescued is down in Florida, where what was once the signature ecosystem of that area, the longleaf pine forest, had been reduced to tiny fragments. And a self-made millionaire down there was stuck in traffic one day, fuming, and looked around in frustration and saw a sign on a high school billboard that said Black Bear Seminar. And he thought, anything is better than this. And he peeled off and went inside the auditorium. And he said there were a couple of old drunks and some Canadian tourists who'd gotten lost and were hoping for some free donuts. And up on the stage was a couple of amazing women talking about the black bears of Florida, a subspecies, the Florida black bear, and how they needed this particular habitat to thrive. And he got hooked. That was his spark bird. And next day he sent them a check for 2 years more of their activities, which shocked them and a little scared them. What does this guy want? Well, he said, what I want is for you to give me a list of the 100 best environmental books, because I need to get up to speed. And he read them, and then he bought 51,000 acres of played out peanut farms and began on them planting 500,000 seedlings of longleaf pine every year. When I met him, he was in year 13, still looked a bit scruffy. Unfortunately, he's passed on since then, but he left behind an endowment to continue the project for the rest of the 300 years. So there are wonderful books to be read, and there's wonderful work that anyone can be associated with. That's one of the reasons I was so happy to be able to show a picture of Humbug Marsh, because right in our own backyard, we all live in an ecosystem wherever we are. Our opportunities, sometimes if you don't quite know how to get connected to people, Google something about a local land trust or trails group or just a neighborhood association. Somehow we're all in this together.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I was going to ask you what someone could do to sort of seek out their spark bird, even if they're, like I mentioned before we went live, I haven't really been further than the sort of my walking route this past year. But I mean, I'll add to that as well as someone who's new to this and maybe still looking for their spark bird. I told you I was able to go up north recently, up north Michigan, as we like to say, walking nature trails. And that's a great way too, because you find out who is protecting those and preserving those. You learn a lot about exactly the kind of ecosystem that's in your backyard, what animals live there. And it's a wonderful stepping stone to getting involved, because you are seeing the diverse, the biodiversity that's right around you, and you can sense how important it is just to that moment, because it always feels really good to take a long hike, but also you understand why it's worth preserving. So I appreciate you reminding folks of that, because I think that's really one of the sort of the through lines of this book. Is you have done so much research and seen efforts around the world, and they do, and as you mentioned in your presentation, they have that sort of common thread, which is that people were sparked to participate and to join these conservation efforts ultimately, and it was as simple as sort of reconnecting oneself with the beauty of our natural landscapes. So
well, the cleanup story of the Detroit River is one of the great inspiring stories, because it got delayed for a long time because it was thought we can only do one thing at once. We can only have industry or nature. Turns out that's not an either or choice. We can have clean water and the fish can return, and we can still do what humans need to do to make a living. So,
well,
bravo, Humbug Marsh.
That's right. That's my next stop on my tour of Michigan natural places to
So
enjoy.
it's not bah humbug, it's ah humbug.
That's right. Well, Tony Hiss, we've reached the top of the hour. Thank you so much for joining us at Home with Literati this evening, and for talking to us about Rescuing the Planet, which viewers can buy at the link that's in the chat. And of course, if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are links in the description below. And we have signed book plates already, but if you want a personalized signed book plate from Tony,
I will be happy to inscribe a book plate.
yeah,
Just
we
let
will.
James know.
Let me know, because we can set it up through the power of the USPS. But
And
Tony,
thank you for being such a wonderful interviewer. I really appreciate it.
oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for writing such a terrific book and sharing it with us and our community. And hope to have you in the store sometime soon when we're open again and people are moving about. But until then, please be well. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you at the next event. Take care.
Good night.
Good night, Tony.
Good night.